It's that time of year again when the 193 members of the United Nations meet to discuss the most pressing problems of our time. It's the 72nd General Assembly, but it's US President Donald Trump's first. So what is Trump's message to the world? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to this special edition of the programme. We're here in New York at the UN in order to look a little bit more closely at some of the foreign policy issues raised by Donald Trump's first address to the General Assembly. Now, we know that Mr. Trump is not particularly comfortable with the traditional global leadership role of the United States. Instead, he'd rather concentrate much more on matters at home. Make America great again. That's what he says. Despite that, he finds himself centre stage in a North Korea crisis. There's ethnic cleansing underway in Myanmar. 5 of his closest Middle East allies are involved in a deepening dispute. And what about Syria? Is he happy to leave Syria to the Russians to sort out? And then there's the UN itself. Everybody expects that he is going to reduce the amount of US funding. So we've got lots to talk about. But first, let's have this report from our diplomatic editor, James Bays.
Donald Trump is the 13th US president to come here to address the UN. And with the North Korea crisis deteriorating, he knew the world would be hanging on his every word.
Well, the message is really a message of peace. It's a message of coming together.
But once he headed to the General Assembly chamber,
His Excellency Donald Trump,
he had a very different message, delivering a speech that astonished many diplomats by including an unprecedented threat to annihilate another UN member state.
The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime.
The words were just the sort of language that earlier the UN Secretary General had warned against.
Fiery talk can lead to fatal misunderstandings. The solution must be political, and this is a time for statesmanship. We must not sleepwalk our way into war.
President Trump's foreign policy challenges are growing. His critics say it's only of his own making. He doesn't now just face possible confrontation with one nuclear power, North Korea, but with a second one, Iran too, as he continues to suggest he's likely to pull out of the 2015 nuclear deal.
The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into. Frankly, that deal is an embarrassment to the United States, and I don't think you've heard the last of it, believe me.
That received strong support from Israel's Prime Minister, but only tepid applause from those in the General Assembly.
So I've listened to countless speeches in this hall, but I can say this: none were bolder, none were more courageous and forthright than the one delivered by President Trump today.
The UN is normally a place of nuance and compromise, but President Trump sees things in starkly black and white terms. Even some of the countries that are normally friendly to the US are alarmed. One Western foreign minister told me that President Trump's comments on North Korea were unhelpful, and a senior Security Council diplomat said to me, why does he want to provoke 2 simultaneous nuclear crises? James Bays, Al Jazeera at the United Nations.
Right, let's introduce our guests now. We have Evan Siegfried, political strategist and author of a book called GOP GPS. We have Jeannie Zaino, Professor of Political Science and International Studies at Iona College, and Ian Williams, who's a former president of the UN Correspondents Association and author of Untold, the real story of the United Nations in peace and in war. And it's not that long either. Ian, let's start with you then. What are the headlines? The headlines for you from this 41-minute speech that was so widely anticipated?
Well, it wasn't as bad as we widely anticipated. I think for even the delegates, they were waiting. It's often considered a bit impolite to threaten to destroy a country to save it.
Doesn't happen often, does it, at the UN?
No. I mean, we will bury you. I think Khrushchev said, but he said it sort of metaphorically. He didn't threaten to destroy the nation, not the leadership, the nation. And I hope that was a misspeaking. And of course, the tirades against Venezuela and Iran. Venezuela, I think, to some extent justified, but the Iran is obviously, he'd spoken to Netanyahu earlier, so we were getting a replay on the whatever he was told.
In fact, I'd come back to that in just a moment. Jeannie, for you, what were the things that really stood out?
I think what stood out, as Ian mentioned, he stayed on prompter, so he gave a better speech than we sometimes hear when he veers off. But I think for me, the real thing that stuck out was it seemed to be patchwork together, a message to his base as he's talking about the economy and middle-class issues that can hardly be of concern to delegates in the room or the world.
It was strange, wasn't it,
It was
the way the speech
strange.
started?
And then also weaving in this America First vision, which I know we're going to talk about. But to me, I have more questions now than I think I did going into this speech as to exactly what that means, because on the one hand, he's talking about sovereignty, and on the other hand, he's talking about taking action in countries like North Korea, destroying them, Venezuela. So I left the speech wondering, if I was looking for clarity, I did not find it in terms of his vision in this speech.
So, Evan, are we looking at an America that is continuing to be engaged in the world, or are we looking at an isolationist future as far as the United States foreign policy is?
We're looking at an America that's playing footsie with the world right now. It kind of wants to, but it doesn't. It's like that guy you were told in high school never to date, but you kind of are attracted to. I think that what we heard from this speech are two things. One, this speech was not for the international community. This speech was delivered for the American people, and that was a mistake on the president's part. He should have been talking to the international community and saying, this is what the Trump doctrine is. We didn't hear a Trump doctrine. We didn't hear what the Trump foreign policy is. We've only seen patchwork from the moment he took office, from the strike in Syria to how he's ignored other problems, such as Chinese expansion.
There was a phrase that was used a couple of times which struck me, and I wondered what it actually meant, and that is principled realism. If indeed there is a doctrine that we saw unfolded at the General Assembly, that might be the title of it. Ian, any guesses as to what that really
yes,
means?
I mean, it's been part of the Republican playbook for some time. It's squeezed in, I suspect, by some of his neocons, that you have principles, but you're very pragmatic and realist about how you get them. And remember what was said in the previous era under George Bush was, we're going to reshape the world to fit our designs. And so I think there's echoes of that, but very, very light echoes. I mean, as you were saying, I think it was a concatenation of isolated prejudices and reflexes. The reflex to Iran because he's palling up to Netanyahu, Venezuela because he doesn't like it, as he made very plain.
There's a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela.
I
think
agree,
it is important that more people talk about it.
But he did not
There's
suggest what to do
rather big
about
one
it.
in Myanmar as well, which didn't deserve a
He
mention at
didn't
all.
suggest what to do about it. I mean, this was the real point, is a lot of his diagnoses were accurate. Yes, the UN is a bureaucracy. Everybody's complained about it. The Secretary General complains. Every Secretary General complains about the bureaucracy at the UN. They can't get anything done. I mean, one Secretary General complained to me he couldn't get somebody appointed. I said, well, fire them. and he didn't. But that's the natural. What he was short on was actually suggesting what he was going to do about it. And cutting the UN's budget was not a pragmatic proposal, even though he made that conditional as well, which I thought was interesting. Because he said, if we have to pay this money, which I object to in a very curmudgeonly and miserly way, maybe it wouldn't be so bad if it was effective.
Well, he's a transactional president, isn't he? And that's what we saw today again. I'm just wondering, because some people have already suggested that what we've seen is another axis of evil. You already mentioned George W. Was this another updated axis of evil?
I took away from the speech that it absolutely is. And he has added to the list of what he calls rogue states and these bad actors in the world community. And I think one of the things we haven't mentioned here that really struck me was this is a president who went to the UN and talked about the world basically going to hell. Something that those of us in the US are familiar with, because he gave an inaugural address which was incredibly negative and pessimistic and dark. So this speech also had some very odd echoes of that. And to Ian's point, far less about what are we going to do to rectify these problems he sees and he finds, and much more kind of calling people and places out without really owning our role in some of these issues and also what we would do to move forward. And that's where I have a real problem with the speech itself. It was not a forward-looking speech in terms of what is this Trump presidency going to mean for us in the United States and for the world.
Let's look more closely then at Iran, because I mean he outlined a series of offences, if you like, that he considers Iran has committed. One being involvement, funding of Hezbollah, involvement with Assad, and also fueling the war in Yemen. That was the only time Yemen was mentioned in the speech. What does he propose to do? Is he going to rip up the nuclear accord, or is he going to renegotiate it, alter it in some way?
Well, what Donald Trump ends up doing on the Iran deal will really depend upon what mood he wakes up in, because he hasn't figured out himself. He has advisors who believe that the Iran deal was bad, but ripping it up would create so many consequences and have such a domino effect that would be negative and make the world worse off, even if you replaced it with something else, that wouldn't be feasible. There are others who say, just tear it up and show them that you're tough.
I mean, he was so uncomplimentary about it. He said it's an embarrassment to the United States.
But it was a complete breach of protocol for a US president to stand up there.
When has Donald Trump ever stood on protocol?
A previous president's initiative, backed by Congress, in such round terms. I mean, it doesn't often happen. There are ways to say these things, and he didn't. And of course, what he doesn't realize, because he doesn't do joined up thinking, is the next president is going to come along and say, don't care what he said. This is a different administration. That was a disastrous administration, and we're going to do differently. So he is providing the material for his own sort of abnegation in future. If he wants to look for posterity, he's just burnt it.
And his view of the world at the moment, not the dystopian view that we saw in the inaugural speech exactly, but he talked about this being a time of immense promise and great peril.
Yeah, and it is really striking. And another thing that was really striking is Benjamin Netanyahu's response to the speech, as I think the quote I read was that he thought it was the best speech he'd heard in 30 years.
That's since he wrote half of it.
There was a cutaway of him where he was nodding and smiling with complete
I think I heard him applauding as well. I presume it was from his
Exactly. And you know, maybe the only person we've heard, you know, even Donald Trump's base is going to have a lot of issues with this speech, because he says one thing and then he says another. And so nobody can come out completely thrilled with the speech except for Benjamin Netanyahu, which was amazing to me.
What I've seen from Trump's base so far is they liked it. They thought it was tough. It was sort of that cowboy American image that they really like. But there was something else in the speech that we've all not recognized at this point so far. He talked about refugees and how they need to stay local. That sort of nationalism is what is going to help him here at home, especially with the courts taking up his refugee ban and saying whether or not they can come into the United States.
So
that's
specifically, he said it was worth the Americans paying a lot more money to keep refugees as close to home as possible.
It's a wink
while
to
he's
his
cutting
base.
back the very budgets that UNHCR and the other agencies could use to keep them there. He's saying, I'm going to cut your budget by a quarter or 20%. But yes, you can have money to keep them there and don't bring them here. Once again, it's not joined up thinking.
Also, the issue of the Middle East and obviously the GCC dispute. Didn't refer to it directly, did he? But he made a reference to the funding of terrorism and the supporters of terrorism, harking back almost to the Riyadh summit at which the dispute actually began. And then again, the cutaway at the United Nations television was to the Saudi Arabian foreign minister. He's personally said that he's going to get involved. He's going to try to work this out. How?
Well, the purpose of Saudi Arabia sometimes is to make Iran look good. in terms of social and sexual politics. And the continual harping on this, once again, it was the sound of silence. You pick on the enemies you want, you shout and you swing from the rooftops, and you ignore far worse perpetrators because they don't fit your particular set of prejudices this week. And I think that's part of it. I mean, these are all powder kegs, and they all need attention. They need joined up thinking because they spill over to each other. Everybody's watching, as you were saying. The North Koreans are watching the Iranians are watching what's happening there. The Russians are watching happening and thinking, well, no noise about Crimea. We may as well go and take off Estonia and Latvia as well. I mean, the messages are being sent by silence as well.
But again, this emphasis on sovereignty, which sounded almost as if it was a throwback to an earlier time, didn't it? Sovereignty and strong sovereign states. He said that's what's going to make the future of a successful UN.
What it was, and where the sort of philosophy coming in there, is that you can't have supernatural governments and authorities. It was a disavowal of... he talked about the trade treaties. He's talking about the European Union, the trade blocs. And what he really is talking about atomizing the world at a time when we have actually been to create things like the International Criminal Court, the Tribunal on the Law of the Sea. We've got a whole set of rules that the world can function by, and he wants us to reduce us to a Hobbesian, each country by itself will hold itself.
He's part of that last gasp of with the generational conflict that has really been going on across the world, especially in Western democracies. We saw it in Brexit, where it was older voters who said leave. It was younger voters who said remain. We saw it here in the presidential election in this past November. It was younger voters who wanted Hillary Clinton and to be more of a global community, whereas older voters were more toward Trump.
To a point.
And with Macron. And I think that's he is that last gasp of the baby boomer. We want to stay isolated, don't like that the world has become smaller because of technology.
Okay, but this last gasp is going to last at least 4 years, we imagine. What does it tell us as to how the United States is going to engage with the international institutions around the world and deal with the conflicts around the world, which, of course, the United States is still looked to as the main solver, the main solution provider, despite Donald Trump not wanting to engage?
With all this talk, to your point about him being so transactional, in terms of sovereignty, it's very much at odds with what he did in Syria, as an example. It's very much at odds with what he talks about with North Korea or Venezuela. And so I'm not sure we could put any stake in what he said today. And this is where I think we have a real problem as countries look around the world. If you don't have a vision as to how you see the United States' place in the world, and you are the President of the United States, what is going to happen? It's very tough for people to take you at your word. And this seemed to me a very contradictory speech that left us very much where we've been in the United States vis-a-vis foreign policy for a long time, which is that we will go in when it suits our interests and we will tell you what we're interested in, and we won't when we don't want to. All he's done is put a tag on it of America first, sovereignty, nationalism, sovereignty. And to me, it doesn't really move us forward at all.
Evan, what did you make of the bit about Venezuela? Because, as we know, quite recently, he said that all options are on the table. Obviously, Central and Latin America more generally shudders at the past of American involvement in the region, which has been undercover for the most part, but it also has been about regime change, hasn't it? Do we think that we could be entering another phase like that with Venezuela?
Well, I think he was far more eloquent today than he was at his golf club when he said all options are on the table. I actually thought that a lot of independents and Republicans liked the line saying the problem in Venezuela is that we've seen socialism successfully enacted. They are in the middle of a humanitarian crisis where they are slaughtering animals to eat, breaking into zoos and killing them, eating garbage. That is no way for anybody in the world to live in this day and age. And I think that when you see Maduro not addressing these problems and protests every day and more people becoming victims of this regime, the United States still has a moral authority to try and help. Whether it should not be military action at this point, obviously. We should be going in and trying to engage in providing humanitarian aid. But the sham of election that Maduro threw a couple of weeks ago, that is an issue that needs to be taken up by the United Nations and strongly condemned by the global community.
The issue of sovereignty also would come into play here as well, because Maduro has been elected at some point. There's a constituent assembly now, the super body, if you like.
Maduro claims that he had the most votes in any Venezuelan election ever, when turnout is put at much lower than most elections. So I'm not entirely sure how Maduro aced mathematics in that calculation. But I think that we do have a responsibility as the United States to lead the global community in condemning Venezuela and show that there are consequences for ignoring the will of the people and suppressing them.
But this is exactly where I think Donald Trump gets himself into a bind, where on the one hand he's saying respect to nations and sovereignty, and on the other hand he's talking about intervening, hopefully not militarily, but otherwise, into a sovereign nation. And the question has always been, where do you draw the line? What is in the United States' interest? This is a man who campaigned on this kind of isolationism that the Republican Party hasn't really seen to this extent, and yet he seems to talk out of both sides of his mouth when it comes to these really critical vision, principled issues.
I suspect his sovereignty spiel was actually talking to the gallery in the General Assembly, because who is it who talks about sovereignty? It's all the people who are killing their own people and say they have a sovereign right to do it. No, it was the Serb regime, it's the Russians, it's the Chinese, it's a whole host of people reserve the right to maltreat their own people without interference by the international community. And one of the big tussles over the last 20 years almost, since Kofi Annan introduced the responsibility to protect, as to what extent this can be traded off against sovereignty.
Noticeable by its absence, Africa. No mention of
Congo.
Africa. Is there an Africa policy?
Well, I don't think the United States has had an Africa policy. Congo is the longest lasting war. I mean, it's been like the sort of third world war. It's been carrying on all of this time. Millions of people died, millions of people made homeless. And nobody has a strategy for it. It's something that really demands leadership, and successive US administrations have abdicated on this one.
And the principle of humanitarian intervention. I mean, where is
responsibility to protect, please.
Responsibility to protect.
Don't
right.
like humanitarian
Okay, I see. But where is that? Where does it
it's
fit
there.
in?
I mean, and it was showing signs of being accepted. But then, unfortunately, Tony Blair invoked it in his intervention in Iraq, completely irrelevantly and unjustly, and it gave it a bad name. So it has been advancing. The idea that, I think there's a clear consensus in much of the international community that if we can find some sucker to do it, then someone should stop what the Myanmarese are doing to the Rohingyas, that somebody should stop the other refugee movements, that somebody should stop what's happening in Yemen. The big problem is no one's prepared to do it. And the only country that is in a position to do many of these things, or even to marshal a coalition to do it, has been the United States, which has abdicated from this.
Yes, we haven't been talking about the Rohingya here in the United States. We are thankfully seeing, at least among some political circles on social media, starting to recognize the atrocities that are being committed by the Myanmarese against them. And today, as I understand it, an Assistant Secretary of State met with Aung San Suu Kyi, and then she canceled her trip to the United Nations. But we have a long way to go, and there unfortunately are going to be more people who lose their lives in the interim.
She said that maybe she hadn't seen any evidence for what was happening.
That's a Nobel Peace Prize.
I mean, this is a Pontius Pilate moment, washing her hands of it all. It's
okay. We haven't seen emerge then a coherent policy that we can call a doctrine, a Trump doctrine. How do we think then the United States is going to engage? Jeannie, you in particular, how do you think the US is going to engage with the rest of the world? We've got some very, very critical crises. We're at a particularly dangerous moment on the Korean Peninsula, for instance.
I think what's going to happen is it's going to be very much left up to the whim of Donald Trump and his advisors who are able to get through to him and get his ear. Because that, at least going on what we've seen the last 9 months since he's been in office, is very much what has seemed to have happened. And this is my real concern coming out of this speech. I wasn't incredibly hopeful we would see a visionary speech or we would see some principle. But for anybody who wanted that, it wasn't there, it wasn't clear, and so now what we're left with is this is a man who is going to decide with his key advisors when we do and when we do not, how we do and how we do not. And I think that's a very unsettling message to leave the world at a time with so many crises. I think it's particularly disturbing.
He started off, remember, talking about NATO as being obsolete. He changed. Do you think that we've witnessed a change in attitude with regard to the United Nations?
Well, it depends until he next unchanges it. I mean, we are talking about, if I can introduce a gruesome image, I'm just back from Vietnam and I saw they sell frogs in the market. They've chopped the heads off and skinned them and they're still hopping around with no braid. And it struck me that was a good analogy for this White House's foreign policy.
And at
the
that
twitching
point-
and the spasmodically reflexive.
What an image.
And it was horrifying. I mean, all crawling over each
At
other.
that point, I have to say thank you all very much indeed. Evan Siegfried, thank you very much. Jeannie Zaino, thank you very much. And Ian Williams, thank you very much indeed.
Sorry.
And as ever, thank you very much for watching the programme. If you want to see it again, remember you can always go online, aljazeera.com. You can go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. There's also the Twitter sphere at AJ Inside Story. I'm at Martine Dennis. So thank you from the whole team here in New York. See you soon.